Good evening. I am Mark Payot, president of Hauser Wirth, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. In conversation, Glenn Ligon with Gregg Bordowitz, which is moderated by Thomas Gebremedhin. We opened last night the Glenn Ligon show in our gallery in Chelsea with the wonderful title, It's Always a Little Bit Not Yet. Please come and visit this extraordinary exhibition. Glenn Ligon has shown in museums and galleries around the world since 30 years and is considered one of the most important artists of his generation. For the occasion of this exhibition, Hauser Wirth Publishers has published a new book entitled Work, 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 focusing on the making of Glenn's work on his process of creation. This documentation in the book is set in dialogue with a poem by Gregg Bordowitz, an artist, writer who works in New York and Chicago. Gregg's most recent book, Some Styles of Masculinity, has been published by Canopy. Gregg Bordowitz is also the director of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago Law Residency MFA program. An exhibition of new work entitled Tetragrammaton is on view at the University of Buffalo Art Galleries until March of next year. Glenn and Gregg are longtime friends and are often in dialogue about their practices and have collaborated on other publications in the past. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Thomas Gebremedhin, who is the Vice President and Executive Director of Doubleday, an imprint of Penguin Random House. I would like to thank the Morgan Library and especially Noreen and Adam for hosting us today. Enjoy the event.
Okay, so I think we're taking off our masks. Yeah.
Okay.
So you can see our beautiful smiles. Hello, everyone.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, it's great.
Indoor events.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
New world. So as Mark mentioned, the two of you have been friends for a very long time. So could you tell us when you first met, and do you recall first experiencing the other's art?
Let's start with the tough questions. When did we first meet?
Well, we were thinking about that the other day. We just both couldn't decide. I think I was aware of your work. We were both traveling in the same circles in the late 80s and 90s. I don't remember a moment. I think I remember in the 90s greeting you at the Art Institute when you spoke, and we both already kind of knew who each other was.
Right. Yeah.
And I remember seeing some of the first Richard Pryor paintings at Artist Space, and I realized that wasn't in the 90s. That was in the early 2000s, I think. I mean, when did you first make those paintings?
I don't know. Yeah, maybe started in the mid-90s or earlier, and then there was a kind of a lull because they scared me, and then they started them up a couple of years later. So you must have seen maybe in Blackmail, which is at the Whitney in '94. Maybe that's the first time they were kind of in a museum setting.
Right.
So
right.
And you became friends slowly over time, or was it?
I was too intimidated to talk to Gregg.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I got over that, but it took a while. But admired the writing and admired the film work that I'd seen. And as I said, we were sort of in kind of the same circle of friends. Stephen Andrews, who's here, artist friend from Toronto. But yeah.
Yeah, I just have flashes of, we were with Stephen and Kendall in Chelsea at some point, and then I think that we just had a conversation. We knew each other, and then at a certain point we started having more and more conversations. So it built over time.
Mm-hmm.
And you two have been collaborating for a very long time. So how do you approach these joint projects, specifically this new book that we're here to discuss?
Well, this book is a bit of an anomaly, I guess, in some ways, because it started out as initially when I was thinking about it, it was going to be a book for the exhibition that's up at Hauser Wirth now, but I realized that that's not the way I work, basically. To have a book for an exhibition that's only up for a month and a half means all that work has to be done months and months in advance. I've never really worked like that for gallery exhibitions. And so I sort of thinking about it more carefully about what this book could be, and decided that it would be interesting then to, in some ways, document the process of making work rather than documenting finished work. You know? And so I just scrolled through my iPhone. And the book is basically 4 or 5 years worth of selected out of iPhone photos that I've taken or people have sent to me, and roughly in chronological order, so that you see in the book the progression of work that, some of the work that ended up in the show, some of the work that's in an exhibition in Zurich at Hauser Wirth, some of the work that's in the trash, you know, because artists make work that's not any good. And you throw it out, but it's in the book.
And Gregg, how did you get involved?
I'm very grateful, and I was going to thank Glenn for asking me. I was really honored and pleased to be asked to write for this book. I've written about Glenn's work before. Glenn asked me to write for the catalog for Encounters and Collisions, which was the catalog for Glenn's Nottingham Tate show. And I realized that I had so much more to write about Glenn's work that I asked, with Glenn's permission, approached After All to write a book-length essay on Untitled I Am a Man, 1988, the painting. And so I've been writing and thinking about Glenn's work for a long time, or fairly long time. And I still want to and will eventually write about debris fields and the current work. But with this project, Glenn asked me to write a text, and I was really thrilled to write one, but Glenn and I both talked about it and the form, and we realized that a monographic essay, we both thought that a monographic essay wouldn't be appropriate to this kind of book.
Yeah. So does the others' work inform your own, even when you're not actively collaborating? Like, do you send one another projects in progress?
Gregg's in the studio a lot, so he's seeing work being made. And I was thinking about this today, that often, you know, and maybe this isn't your experience, but my experience is often you're making work, but you don't have any vocabulary around it. And what's been really helpful about being in dialogue with Gregg is that he often gives me the vocabulary about how to think about the work, you know?
Yeah.
Because that is very productive in kind of figuring out what the work is, you know?
Right.
Is like, oh, what is this work actually about? What things can it be about? And also because Gregg is able to bring a lot of references to me, things that I should be thinking about, things he's thinking about. The overlaps in our practice become a point of discussion. So that's been enormously helpful. I mean, we can talk about the work you have in the show at University of Buffalo too, but seeing your making that work, seeing the print studio, thinking about working within the sort of set parameters was really helpful for me, thinking about the work that I was doing too.
I think about Glenn's work often, and Glenn is inspiring to me, and I think Glenn is one of the most important artists of my generation. I'm just privileged and very happy to be friends with Glenn. I enjoy our conversations very much, which are really wide-ranging, but I've been thinking about how text is image and image is text for a long time, not only in my own work, but in Glenn's work, and many, many others. It's a preoccupation and something that Glenn and I share, because we share many coordinates in terms of the art that we admire, the thinkers that we've been influenced by. And,
who are some of those authors and thinkers, out of curiosity?
Fred Moten, definitely. Who else?
Well, I was going to think Baldwin. I mean,
oh, well, sorry. Yes, Baldwin. Yes,
but yes, Fred is very important. And but I was also thinking, when I was saying that, I was thinking more in the past. Like we both think about, come out of, kind of, or think about our work in relationship to the histories of various conceptualisms, particularly American conceptual art. And so I think when Glenn was a young artist, we've talked about this, you were looking at Kossuth and the Seth Siegelub crowd, and so was I, and we have very different feelings about those bodies of work now, but I was an assistant to Joseph Kossuth in the 80s, and was interested in that history and what can be done with words and text and ideas in various media.
You know, what I found very interesting about both of your individual practices is that you, at times, incorporate and interrogate humor. You know, who and what is funny and why. So, you know, Glenn, you've pulled from Richard Pryor's stand-up for some of your text-based paintings, and Gregg, you've talked about how humor is used in Jewish culture to deal with trauma and pain. So I wonder, how does humor inform your work? And, you know, especially given that the art world is a bit self-serious as well.
Well, I think for me, these paintings that I've done that use transcriptions I've made from Richard Pryor, comedy albums or films, was about switching the source material for my text-based work, because it had in the past been about literary sources, Jean Genet, Zora Neale Hurston, Baldwin. So I thought, well, there are other ways to bring text into the work, and you know, Richard Pryor as a sort of person commenting on American society, on sexuality, on race, I thought was in his jokes very astute. But I was also interested, I think, if you put an essay in the painting, that's an essay, that's in a written form. If you transcribe a joke, that's speech. And so the insertion of speech into the space of painting was part of the idea behind those paintings for me. But yeah, it was about inserting a different kind of source material, but one that was sort of as pointed as, you know, a Toni Morrison essay.
Right.
Richard Pryor can be as on target as Toni Morrison or on target as Baldwin, you know.
And Gregg, how about for you?
Well, I'm interested in laughter because laughter is not necessarily correlated to being funny. I mean, we laugh because we feel awkward, or we laugh when we see something we don't understand, or when we're nervous in social situations. And so I think that you can expand or extend that to humor. Humor is a way of coping with a lot of different aspects of life, social hierarchy, discomfort again, and also things that are genuinely funny. It's a kind of bodily release. And so I've always been interested in humor. Comedy albums, Glenn and I have talked about it. Glenn and I are around the same age, and we were both listening to Richard Pryor at the time in the 70s as teenagers, but having very different experiences and listening to those albums in very different places, me being in Queens and Glenn being in the Bronx, and so it signifying differently for both of us. But I think that was part of our culture. I mean, I won't speak for Glenn now, but for me, as a teenager, we used to sit around and find places where our parents weren't, and like light up a joint and listen to a comedy album. People used to do that for fun.
People still do.
Yeah. And so Richard Pryor, who taught me a lot about race and gave me a language to talk about racial identity and whiteness, but also it's just so funny.
Yeah.
And again, but that kind of laughter that hurts. And so, but the comedians of that generation and time. So, and particularly for me, I'm sorry.
Oops, that's me.
In my family, we had a lot of record albums, and they were all Borscht Belt albums. So, Mort Saul and Buddy Hackett. You can name
Shecky Green.
Shecky Green, yeah. Shelley Berman, one of my favorites. So, yeah.
So who's funnier between the two of you?
Oh. I can read a joke.
Huh. Okay.
I can't really tell one.
Okay.
Can you tell a joke?
I don't know if I tell jokes well or not. I'm very interested in being not funny, which that's how you get a laugh, basically.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Gregg has done a whole series of videos that are, one of which is based on the idea of the comedian. So, you are funny. I've seen it.
Well, Lauren Berlant, who was a dear friend who died over this summer, unfortunately wrote some really interesting, serious work about humor, and she was very interested in the position of power that is not funny, like the person who walks in the room and people stop laughing. And she was very particularly attuned to how humor has been thought of or discussed, particularly under the Trump years, and so how a kind of anti-Trump humor was actually maybe kind of diffusing or not really allowing a certain amount of energy around fighting nascent and naked fascism. So actually, again, this notion of not being funny is interesting to me because I began to think of television, like late night television, as not like coping during wartime, but actually as a product, like Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, they're doing their job. It's no disrespect to them, but basically you're purchasing this kind of product, which is like anti-Trump humor that you can count on. And the interesting thing about the Pryor paintings in particular, or this brilliant project that Glenn did of showing live on the Sunset Strip without the sound, which is Richard Pryor's concert movie, without the sound, and just framing Richard Pryor's body within that film. And also the Pryor paintings in the context of the museum are not funny.
They're a problem
to
be negotiated by these institutional spaces, which is not why I made them, but was the result, I think, of showing them in these,
And just on a personal, I think Glenn's hilarious. I mean, Glenn's really funny when we're hanging out.
And that's it. When we're hanging out. Exactly.
So talk to me more about the new book. When you think about it as an object, what were your priorities?
Well, I wanted a kind of telephone book, kind of size book. So this is the book. Because I have seen other books that I'm not going to say what
name them, please.
No, I'm not going to name them, and I'm not going to describe them the way I would describe them if I was just talking to Gregg. But lots of books about nothing, basically, with a lot of pictures. So this is not a book about nothing, but I think when we were talking about it, and we sort of decided that it wouldn't have a traditional essay about the work, that kind of freed me up to really think through, like, you know, photos in chronological order create a kind of order, you know? And they're beautiful kind of progressions of photos just because of the way they're, you know, the order in which they were taken. And there are also these beautiful correspondence between Gregg's text and those photos that is arbitrary because the poem wasn't laid out, you know, sort of in a direct relationship to the images, which are flashing behind you. So those are 2-page spreads in the book that you're seeing. So that kind of freeing up of the book to do what it was going to do in a kind of chance way was really new for me. I've never done a book like that. And so I think when Gregg proposed doing haikus for the book, it sort of freed up what the book could be.
And can you talk to us a little bit more about that? What about the form of the haiku felt well suited to accompany the images?
Well, I can't stop writing haikus. I was having trouble reading and writing during the pandemic.
You wrote the pandemic haikus, right?
And I wrote this book called Pandemic Haikus, which was a giveaway at my show at PS1. And a poet friend, a good friend, Joy Layden, was, you know, commiserating with Joy and about not being able to read and not being able to focus. This is the early days of lockdown. And Joy said, well, have you ever read short forms like haiku? And actually, I hadn't read haiku since like high school or something like that. So at Joy's suggestion, I read Robert Haas's translations of Basho, Busan, and Isa. And then I discovered that Richard Wright, author of Native Son, wrote haikus for the last 2 years of his life. And
Really?
there's a book that is in print today of Richard Wright's haikus. He wrote something like 8,000 haikus at a time when he was living in the south of France in exile and not healthy and unable to sit in one position for long periods of time. So inspired by Wright's haikus, because they are written in American English and African American idiom, which is different than reading translated Japanese haiku, I just started adopting the form, and I use syllabics and as a constraint for other forms of poetry, meaning I count syllables and, you know, we'll write, you know, 10-syllable lines or whatever. So I really fell into the 5-7-5 formula really fast. So quickly, it's just that I wanted to write something that would serve the book and also would give latitude to the design. So I composed a poem. I consider it to be a complete composition. The only thing that I asked was that it be published, could be distributed any way. Each stanza kind of stood alone and could be delinked from other stanzas, but the poem had to flow in the order that I composed it.
Would you mind reading some of them?
No, not at all. I'll just find some at random. There was a kind of randomizing process with the design too, which I liked. Although we did pay attention to adjacencies and enjambment with the poems, I did not look at the photos to write these. In fact, Glenn downloaded an early folder of photos from your iPhone, which I purposely did not look at. And
why is that?
I'm really interested to like immerse Cunningham and Cage, and this idea of, you know, the dancers don't hear the music before the dance, and the musicians don't see the dancers, and the set designer doesn't see any of it, and it all just comes together on opening night.
Yeah.
And like how that would happen in this context. So we also, Glenn and I were both concerned that these stanzas wouldn't function as captions, so there's no one-to-one correlation. So I didn't even want to have that in my head. So I wrote the poem in 2 sittings. One was where I recalled visits to Glenn's studio, and then I asked Glenn's permission to go sit in his studio when he was traveling, and wrote the second half of the poem just listening to the sounds in the studio. And I don't remember which one is which from now, but I just opened to this page. So paintings are double-hinged, Fred texts, Taine of the mirror, walls know front and back. The hands know their lines, palm readers and psalmists know only what is touch. Felt, fibers, millions, held together by friction, canvas and textiles. The shared histories, dyes and mordants, fixity, cloth parchments and scrolls. Holy, moth-eaten, wormy with bacteria, breathe, remember, breathe, sucking air through teeth, damn, what? Gasping, astonished, Warhol just said G.
Thank you.
What was nice about it, that format, and Gregg's suggestion that he write a long poem was, we were in dialogue in the studio, but also when he suggested he come when I wasn't there, just to be in the space of the studio, that was super interesting to me, because I couldn't imagine, like, well, what will you learn? You know? But half of the text in there is about that experience of being in the studio, and I forget, because it's a workspace for me. And I know, you know, when I'm in a groove in the studio, I know when I've had bad studios, I know I love the studio space I'm in now. But you sort of forget at a certain point that the environment that you make something in has a direct influence on the things you're making and how the energy you have in there and how long you want to be there, or, you know, because the studio is not a factory. I mean, it is not for me. So it's really nice to be in a place that I actually want to be in.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So how did working on this, both the artwork and the book and the writing during the pandemic, affect your processes? Not just logistically, but in terms of how you actually came to and shaped the work itself.
Oh, interesting. Well, as I said, there's a lot of documentation of things that are never going to be out in the world, because I've already thrown them out. So that was, I thought, kind of a risk in a way, you know, because I'm not explaining to the reader that, you know, this work doesn't no longer exist, this work exists, this led to this. But some of that can be figured out if there's a careful looking at the images. And also, I think I took images in the studio, kind of embarrassing to say this, but it's partially true, just for my insurance company, you know? Just to be like, this is on the walls in case it all burns down. Here's my proof.
Yeah, they're here right now, actually.
Yeah.
The representative from your insurance
Right,
company.
so the chub guys are in the back. But it was a way of sort of doing that. But then when I started working on the big paintings, one that's in Zurich and one that's in the gallery here, I got interested in just documenting the process of making those paintings, so I just knew how to make the next one, you know, or the next, you know, oh, this color black on this panel, or, you know, just the quick iPhone photos was just a way of documenting that. So it came about quite organically when I realized that I had this sort of, you know, my brain, as my partner James says, my brain, my phone, contained all these memories of working in these studio spaces.
And you both were able to maintain the same level of creative output during the pandemic, or?
No, I mean, you can talk about, I mean, you know, for months I did these collages, kitchen table kind of collages in lockdown. I was also, Gregg saw some of them too. I was also working on these self-portraits, and then none of this work, this is all in the flat files or in the trash. But what I realized was, many months later, that this was about being in contact with people, even if it was images of people. So I'm making all these collages of images of people cut out of magazines, and like, Dr. Freud, in lockdown, sitting by myself for months at a time, working with images of people. And generally my work isn't figurative at all. So that was sort of super interesting to think about retrospectively. The work wasn't any good. And then when things opened back up and I could go back to the studio and have people there as well, then started working more on the work that was going to be for these various shows, even though they had been delayed a year, which gave me more time to work on them, and the book too.
And how was it for you, Gregg?
I would say my work habits just changed. They just became different. I don't know if it was more or less productive. I was still directing my program from a laptop. The MFA program that I direct for the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I was still writing haikus and drawing and thinking about this new body of work. I had a show at PS1, a retrospective that opened in March. It was delayed for a year, but I was still thinking about that. And also, I just developed new habits, new ways of spending time that I would consider to be work. I try not to think, what I'm doing when I'm doing it is what I do. So I don't really like to have those separations. So I couldn't read, so I started writing haikus. I started a drawing practice. I have a lot of dailiness in my life. That's how I got through it. But then I started listening to music for hours. That replaced reading. Like, I just decided, okay, now's my time to listen to the entire catalog of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. And I would just stay at home, and my partner, Christine, is used to me. She understands there's like a lot of horizontal work in my practice. I just lay around and I am working, but I'm just like laying around, staring up at the ceiling.
Yeah, I relate to that entirely.
So there was a lot of laying around, staring up at the ceiling and listening to the art ensemble. Then it shifted to Ellington studies and just things like that.
I remember Gregg invited me to teach a couple of times for the Art Institute of Chicago summer program, and I remember this discussion where I always refer to myself as painter, even though I do neons and I've made videos and all sorts of things, but my default is I'm a painter. And Gregg said, well, I write, I make films, I teach, I consider all of it my practice, I don't make these separations. And I was like, ooh, that was a shot across the bow. But it was great for me to really think through that, these artificial separations between various things that one does. To be able to realize that all of these things inform each other, that they're not separated. But Gregg has much more discipline than I do. So, he's describing all the things that he was doing, and I was like, I make collages in my kitchen, that's it, and a lot of Netflix, But the Netflix wasn't any different than before the pandemic,
No.
So, but just the idea that sometimes as an artist you get stuck, and you never seem to be stuck to me. You seem to be able to change it up,
Thanks. I think I can't decide. It's just, at a certain point, I'm 57 now, so I just decided, let the other people figure it out. I mean, I don't think of it that way. What's that?
I said that sounds freeing.
Yeah. But I understand and respect why, Glenn, you would say you're a painter, because it's that modality that shapes your work and informs your decisions, even when you're working in other media. I mean, when it comes down to it, basically, you could say I'm a writer because I think about things through syntax and grammar. But it is freeing, I think, just to... My notion of identity politics is just let as many of the labels stick to the point where the self can't bear the weight and it collapses on itself.
Well, that's interesting because you both consistently challenge your viewers and readers to reconsider ideas of identity, be it sexuality or blackness. Gregg, you, in response to the white supremacist riots in Charlottesville in 2017, created a series of monologues just grappling with your identity as a queer Jewish man. So I am curious to hear from both of you what you think the responsibility of an artist is politically. Like, is there an obligation to respond to what is happening out there in the world, especially now?
Gonna do rock, paper, scissors?
Yeah. Well, I'll start in a way. It's an interesting question because, and this is not your question, but a question has come up often in relationship to my work about its timeliness, in relationship to thinking about using particularly Baldwin text. And the way I usually think about that is that the moment I became interested in Baldwin within the space of my work was not this moment of Baldwin. Baldwin is everywhere now. Well-quoted, amazing movies about him, incredible people thinking through Baldwin. I seem to be... But the moment that I became interested in him, he wasn't everywhere. People weren't interested in him that way. He wasn't fashionable, you know? And I'm always interested in that moment when an author has gone in some ways out of view. That's a moment I think is an interesting moment to look at them again. And that's the moment when those text paintings started. The painting in the gallery now, you know, a friend was saying, you know, this essay, Stranger in the Village, was written in the early 50s. The last line of it is, "The world is white no longer and never will be white again." I'm misquoting it, but something like that. And she's saying, it's amazing to think that being written in a little Swiss village in the 50s, when Europe still has colonies in Africa, when the villagers think he must be from Africa because America means white. And so even, it's kind of this incredible kind of prescience about where things are going in that essay.
And Gregg, do you ever feel that artists have an obligation to?
I can't say anything for artists. I don't make work out of obligation. I think responsibility is a question of being a human, being a citizen. It's an ethical question. I don't think an artist has any more responsibility than any other profession or job. I make work out of desire. You know, when I started making activist work, I just loved showing up with a camera to protests. I didn't do it because I felt like I didn't have to do it. I just loved taking images of my fellow activists and making those images. And that's always been a good formula. It's like, you know, look around the world and see what images you like and just try to make more of them.
It's a great philosophy, yeah. You know, often I feel, though, that artists of color or queer artists or anyone other, that their work is looked at through a political lens at the expense of the craft itself, technique and form. So I'm curious, what, if anything, do you feel like viewers and critics miss when analyzing your work?
Yeah, there is, when I first started showing kind of late 80s, early 90s, there's so much attention to, particularly around artists of color, queer artists, your message. And, you would read these critics who would say, this work is about this artist's identity. And that's all they would say, as if identity were this thing that's just kind of apparent, I'll often describe it as like a well you just dip into and drink from. It's just there. And it's unmediated and available and known, And so the work has been in some ways working against that knowability, this sort of notion of legibility or knowability as a way to kind of get around this sort of idea.
Yeah, I guess I was kind of split on the question because I've been teaching for over 30 years. I mean, I started teaching when I was really young. And as a teacher at an art school, you encounter the problem of how students are burdened by the presumptions teachers make when they walk into the room based on their appearance. And so that's been a pedagogical issue that I've had to think very sensitively about. And at the same time, I was becoming an artist while I was teaching. So because I was drawn into making queer work and AIDS activist work, and which also thought a lot about sexism and racism, and it was the AIDS crisis is a very complicated complex of problems. I thought to myself, well, I really want to make work about all of these things. I didn't really feel like I had a choice. Like, this is the work I'm going to make. But as a teacher, I became sensitive to not making presumptions about students on the basis of how they appear to me, and developed with other teachers thinking about how to let the conversation about the work arise organically and not place pressure on the student to incorporate some notion of content based on your own presumptions of who they are.
Yeah, whatever the impositions are that the world is placing on them. We're living in a moment, obviously, in which queer artists and artists of color and others have are receiving more critical and commercial attention than ever before. So I'm wondering, how has the reception to your work evolved? Have you noticed any change or?
Well, I think Google has done me a world of good. You don't have to explain everything. It's like, look it up on your phone, like you look everything else up. You don't know who James Baldwin is?
Yeah.
It's available in a way that burden doesn't fall on me. So that's one thing, I guess. I was laughing with someone because I posted about the Museum of Modern Art, and they have a very amazing Jack Whitten painting called Atopolis up for a very long time. And Gregg and I both are Jack Whitten abstract painter, amazing painter, both of us fans of his work. And then they did a rehang, and now there's a Julie Moretu painting in the same place that Jack Whitten was. And I was talking to Julie about that and saying, and she loves Jack Whitten's work too. And I thought, oh, isn't it interesting that when I was a young artist, I used to go to MoMA to make a pilgrimage to see a de Kooning painting named Pirate, because Pirate was always up. And now I go to MoMA to make go see that de Kooning painting, but I also go to see Jack Whitten and Julie Moretu, because you can only make pilgrimages to things that are actually on view, And so the idea that a Jack Whitten painting could be on view for a year is a sea change for a lot of these institutions, The idea that that painting is normalized as the masterpiece it is because it's up in the gallery for a year, because they don't keep crappy things up for a year. Well, sometimes they do, but that particular masterpiece was up and available to be on the pilgrimage trail, you know, in the same way that Demoiselles is always up, or there's a de Kooning always up, you know.
So the centerpiece of your new show is this massive text-based work that adapts the full James Baldwin essay that you referred to earlier, Stranger in the Village, which is about his experiences as a black man in this lily white Swiss town, and comparing that to his experiences as a black man in America. So, you know, you have adapted excerpts previously. So I'm just curious, you know, in working with a text like this again and again, how has your relationship to Baldwin and the essay changed over time? Are you still discovering something new in it?
I think I'm discovering something new in it because other people are reading it closely again. You know, there's a writer that I think is really great, Teju Cole, Nigerian born, lives in the United States now. He retraced Baldwin's steps to Lukurba, this little village that Baldwin had lived and worked in the Swiss mountains, and talked about, you know, I think this essay was maybe written 5 or 6 years ago, talked about, you know, stepping into, symbolically, I guess, into Baldwin's shoes, into his place, but also talking about going by clubs in the town and Beyonce's on the stereo system, and sort of negotiating what it means to, you know, be a black man or black person in that space now versus the space that Baldwin lived in. But he also takes Baldwin to task because the essay has a very limited imagination of what Africa is, you know. Baldwin says, in this Swiss village, the villagers are related to Bach and Beethoven, but imagine myself in this African village, and I'm waiting for the conquerors to arrive, you know. And Teju Cole says, no, that's not Africa. You know, Africa is not this place where we were just waiting to be colonized, and there was no culture here, there's no music here, there's no, you know, nothing. But it's so he's sort of taking Baldwin to task for this limited imagination of what Africa as a continent is, can be. So those rereadings of Baldwin, I think, have changed my readings of Baldwin, you know. And in terms of the painting itself, it's the end of an investigation for me. As you said, I've been often using fragments of Baldwin's essay, and partially that's because I never felt I had the, you know, physical space, mental space, energy to deal with the entire essay. And so these paintings, which use the entire essay, they're 10 by 40 feet, 45 feet. They're the biggest paintings I've ever made. And they're simply determined by, you know, at this typeface, this many words in this essay, this is the size you get.
Right.
So in a way, it's just simply, you know, laying it out on a computer and stenciling one letter at a time. But I thought it was a really good way to sum up this investigation in a way. You know, I was laughing with someone that, like, a younger artist would have started there. And I was like, no, it took me 25 years to get there, you know, to be able to, at first, like, you know, have this admiration for someone like Baldwin, use their words, but in quite reverential way. And now I think I still have that reverence, but I feel like maybe I'm walking with him rather than something else, some other relationship that I had that was too uncritical maybe, or too reverential in some ways. So it's been an interesting process over these 2 decades to work with the same text, you know.
Well, this brings me to my next question, which is, and I want to direct this to the both of you, how do you know when you have finished a project? How do you know when it's done?
You mean a particular work or a
particular work,
series?
A particular work or a project, take it where you will.
Well, sometimes I don't know. I mean, you know, it's one thing to see something in the studio and work on it there, and then it goes to another space and you see things wrong with it, you know. And that happened with these big paintings that I did, because I really didn't have the space to get back on it. I didn't have the proper lighting. One of them we couldn't stretch in the studio, so I never saw it properly stretched on the wall. And I realized, it's not finished, So bring the truck back, bring it back to the studio, work on it. But that's fine, I think, I saw there's a really nice film, I think it's on Art 21, Julia Moretti working on this big mural painting that's at Goldman Sachs down in financial, whatever that's called, financial district, or Battery Park City, it's one of those big
where
buildings.
Souls go to die.
Yeah. And it's a huge painting. It's probably 50 or 60 feet long and high. And they film her making adjustments on it on site. And she says the distance that you can see it from is not a distance I had when I was working on it. So now that it's installed, I see that I need to make this change because I can see it from across the street. And there she is on the scaffolding making that change. And that was super inspiring to me, because you're never really, when things go out the door, people assume you don't get to do anything with them anymore. But I was like, no, you can still.
And Gregg, for you, how do you know when you've reached the end point?
Well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to dodge the question, but I was thinking more about what Glenn said, and I just want to congratulate you, Glenn. I think the new Stranger in the Village paintings are astonishing and tremendous accomplishments. And I'm not astonished that you achieved them, I'm just astonished by them. And there's a lot I've been thinking about your work lately that's about origin as end, or beginning and endlessness in the same objects. I think the debris field paintings are like that for me too. The debris field paintings really are about the problem of creation for me. They're almost theological problems. Is this the end or the beginning of language? Now that I can only see from the large Stranger in a Village paintings that I've seen that somehow it feels like you, Glenn, you kind of a long time ago kind of prehended this structure that you were becoming or bringing into becoming that now exists, which might just be a fantasy or a false telos or something like that, but still now that's how it exists for me. When I was staring at the one at Hauser yesterday, I was just thinking how, again, about this time as in a more circular structure, that this is an end and this is also a beginning, very much in the same way as the debris field paintings are. And then it makes me think about Jack Whitten, and because yesterday I had the pleasure of going to the Whitney Museum storage to look at a Greek alphabet painting that I'm writing about. So Jack did a series of paintings called the Greek Alphabet series, and I was lucky enough, fortunate enough that I'm writing about them so I could go to the storage and talk with the conservator, and we're just trying to figure out in what order did Jack make these marks? How does this even exist? And I'm so fascinated with Jack Whitten as a process artist. And that dovetails with this question of craft too. I feel guilty myself as someone who writes about your work. The opening page of Untitled I'm a Man purposely starts with a 2-page visual description of what I'm seeing that I pretty much wrote in the gallery, in the National Gallery. And because I felt with Encounters and Collisions, I did fall into a habit of looking at, there's two kinds of materialism, and I consider myself to be a kind of materialist, but one would be small m materialism, what's it made of and how is it put together. Large m materialism would be historical materialism, Marxism, what forces of production came together in this person to produce this thing. which includes the psychological. And so I think in writing about your work, Glenn, that I've been going through my own process about thinking about process, like where does the process begin and end? And that's where reading Fred Moten is relevant in many ways, but reading Fred Moten, because Fred's main question is like, what's the precedent? What preceded? Where are you standing before you understood the object? And that's kind of where your work places me as a viewer, which I find so stimulating and exciting, is I don't know if I'm at the beginning or at the end of something. I feel outside of time, and at the same time they're very much of their moment, our moment.
Could you talk about Tetragrammaton?
Sure, briefly. I'm doing this new series of prints. That's my show in Buffalo, and they're all based on the Tetragrammaton. Is the 4-letter Hebrew word for God that's unpronounceable. There's a prohibition about pronouncing the name. In fact, we don't really know how to pronounce the name exactly. And Jews who observe this, like myself, when praying, say a substitute name. Often you say Hashem, which means the name. So I've been basically doing these kind of concrete poems in print form, printing at 10 Grand Press, which is a great press run by Marina Ancona. Writing and rewriting. They're calligraphic drawings, so they're drawings like Glenn. They have constraints, so no line can be generated that's not in the service of forming a letter, and it's just writing and rewriting these 4 letters in different combinations and conjugations, and then arriving at a composition through that way. But in this regard, I've learned much from Glenn, and also it's funny, but it's also, I think, interesting to think about that we both started works called Debris Fields around the same time. Like, this is a humorous point for us. Like, it doesn't really matter. But like, I started writing Debris Field poems in the early teens, like around 2012, 2013, 2014, and you started making those early prints and drawings for the Debris Field paintings, and then the Debris Field paintings. And I think we're both interested. I think, of course, we picked up on that term. That term was in the newspaper all the time. The notion of the debris field, it's the area you search when a plane is crashed or a tornado is hit. It makes a lot of sense that we both feel like we're working amidst the wreckage.
Yeah, of various things.
Yeah.
Society. There's a war reference there too, Yeah. But it was this funny kind of moment of, conjoining of our practices, but also the conjoining of the sort of idea of working within restraints, because the debris field paintings I'm making are all based on 2 silkscreen images, just endlessly screened over one another, with different levels of density, and then stencil made from those shapes that have been silkscreen stenciled over that. So, but kind of, a constraint, there's no outside marks there in some ways, creating a system and then working through it, endlessly.
I think we have run out of time, but I have one last question for you. And it's a bit philosophical, I guess. I'm wondering, what are you expressing in your works that you feel you otherwise wouldn't be able to express? And conversely, are there things that you haven't found a way to say?
Ooh.
You want me to start?
Yes.
It's so interesting because I admire Glenn as an artist, and we're also colleagues and friends, and we're very different artists. That I had a retrospective show that traveled over the past 3 years is kind of like a mystery. Like, it took Stephanie Snyder, a curator, to say you do all these things. Have you ever like had a mid-career show, a career show? And I never thought of myself as an artist who would have a show in a museum. I've rarely showed in galleries. And I'm not saying that, it's not that good or bad. I'm not saying that like opinion is just, Glenn has been working as an artist and thinking about exhibition and curation, you know, in a very different and very rigorous way than I have for the past 30 years. And yet, of course, not of course, but what makes it of course is that we're sitting here now and we find ourselves in this, for me, pleasurable situation of talking. Which is all to say, I don't think I'm expressing anything in my work.
Go on.
I don't think art is about expression. But I would only take that for myself. I mean, I think art is about a navigation of certain principles and parameters, and it's about credibility and belief. It's about faith. It's about a lot of things. And there's a difference between the didacticism in my work and saying something. Like a lot of people, and you know, so yeah. I mean, I'm not afraid of being didactic as an artist because I don't think that art is a representation of a clear signal from sender to receiver. So I could try to be as didactic as I want, and the message will never fully be received.
Right.
And I don't even know what the message is. I mean, use condoms, please. And wear masks. But that's not, I'm not expressing something there. Except maybe my fear and mortal fear and care, but things that don't really have, can't be expressed. I'm always approaching expression.
Would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, that's a tough thing to follow up on, but I guess the first thing that comes to mind is that all of my work is quotation. It's always someone else's text, but the text is never about a sort of, I guess the paintings or whatever I'm doing with it is different than the text. You know, text exists over there. I'm doing something else in the painting. Painting is the text, but it's not the text because it's like a movie adaptation of a novel. They're not the same things. They don't operate the same things. They go in different directions. So that's how I think about it. One of these things that's happened because of the scale of these paintings that I've been working on, the stranger paintings, is just the idea of taking up this much space with Baldwin is kind of, even though this is, you know, Baldwin essay is just a little fragment of his output, you know, but it is kind of interesting to me to take up so much space because I don't think of myself as an artist who normally gravitates towards that. That's not my first impulse. I don't know if I have a particularly good answer to the question, but it's just an interesting moment for me, you know. And perhaps that moment is related to the moment that we're all in, you know, particularly, or a moment that particularly artists of color are in terms of our visibility in the art world right now. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you.
I think audience questions.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
Yeah.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you.